If you have an orchid that needs to be repotted, this is the only video you're ever gonna need. I'm gonna show you everything you need to know to be successful and confident. Now, the very first thing you're gonna need to know is, when do I repot my orchid? Well, the general rule of thumb is when the roots are starting to come out of the bottom drainage holes. This is a great indication that your orchid needs a little bit more room for its roots to grow, and we can help them out by increasing the pot size that way. But we still like to repot our orchids every 1 to 2 years. This is going to refresh the medium that's around the roots, keeping things nice and fresh and airy. It's also a really great idea to wait for the flower spikes to die off. If I repot this plant while the flowers are still on the plant, I risk them dropping prematurely. And although it's not going to kill the plant, it's just going to reduce the longevity of the flowers. Potentially. And the last reason I would repot your Phalaenopsis orchid is just because there's an emergency. Usually like root rot. If you water your orchids too frequently, the roots are going to start to die off. And in that case, I like to intervene to make sure the root rot doesn't spread. One of the main ways we do that is by cleaning the roots and getting the plant into fresh medium. So in recap, we repot every 1 to 2 years when the roots are coming out of the bottom drainage holes or when there's an emergency like root rot. The first thing I want to do is get the plant out of the pot. I'd like to loosen up the roots from the side of the pot by squishing them just like this, and then you can sort of dump out the medium like so. It should come out quite easily now that you've loosened it up from these sides of the pot. Now, just using my fingers, you can wear gloves if you want, whatever you like. I'm just going to remove any of the medium that I can. Now, some of the medium is going to be stuck to the roots like this. That's because these plants are epiphytes. Where they grow in nature, they actually grow on the sides of trees. Not parasitically, but they just use them to anchor. So if this pot is the tree, the roots just kind of grab onto the pot like this, and the orchid kind of grows off the side like so. They use the tree, or whatever structure they're growing on, as an anchor. So it stands to reason that the roots would grab onto the orchid bark in the pot, kind of like it would in nature. You can remove as much as you want just using your fingers. Now, if your medium is really clinging hard to these roots, this happens especially when your orchid is planted in moss. It's a good idea to soak the roots, soak everything before you're doing this. That will help the medium peel away from the roots a little bit easier and with causing less damage. Okay, now that I've got all of the medium off the roots, it's time to do a little bit of root maintenance. What I want to do is identify any roots that have died off, and I want to get rid of them. Dead roots will be anything but firm. It's not necessarily a color that you're looking for, it's the firmness that you're looking for. So I like to pinch them between my finger like so. They might be papery thin, you can even hear that, or they might be mushy. I like to use a sharp pair of scissors for this. I'm going to spray down my scissors with an isopropyl alcohol. And the reason I'm doing this is because we use these scissors to cut on a lot of different plants around our store. And by spraying them with the rubbing alcohol, I'm reducing the risk of any diseases or pathogens spreading from one plant to another. Now, in your home, there's a reduced risk of anything spreading from plant to plant because you're not cutting on them as often, most likely, as we are in a plant store like this, or like they would in a nursery setting. So now all I'm going to do is locate all the roots that are mushy or papery thin, and I'm going to cut them off. But it's always a good idea just to do a little bit of root maintenance when your plant is out of the pot anyway. Now, these roots are extremely dehydrated on this particular plant, also indicated with the very dehydrated and wrinkly leaves. Now, because these roots were so dry and all of the medium was so dry, I don't need to sanitize the roots before repotting them. That's because any of those pathogens that would harm the roots are going to die off just by being in a really dry environment for a period of time. If this plant came in and the roots were really wet and mushy, then right now I would be spraying all of these roots down with hydrogen peroxide. You could also just leave the plant out to dry completely. Once all of the roots are 100% dry, I keep it that way for about 24 hours. This is going to, again, ensure that all of those pathogens are died off, and then I would move on with the repot. But again, since these are dry, we're just going to move on to the next step. What kind of soil should you plant your orchids in? Now that we have our orchid out of its pot, the roots are cleaned up, we need to put it back into a new pot with some fresh medium. There are several ways you can do that. The first thing you can do is just let it be an orchid. Like I said, orchids grow on the sides of trees. Remember, this was our tree. The orchid roots just grab onto the tree, and these roots are actually never exposed to a real soil or even a real medium. They just grow on the sides of trees. And if you wanted to do that, that's perfectly fine. You just have to make sure to keep up with the watering because these roots are going to dry out very quickly. Another very common medium is long fiber sphagnum moss. They typically will come in a brick, something like this. It's dehydrated and you will need to hydrate them yourselves. But this medium is very, very common because it provides moisture to the roots, but also airflow to the roots. This is a great medium if you don't pay attention to your orchids very often, if you don't want to water very often. And that's because this moss retains quite a bit of moisture, which is why your orchid coming from the grocery store will often have them planted in this moss, because when they're growing in a greenhouse with the really high temperatures and the really, really bright light, they want the medium to retain a little bit more moisture so they don't have to water it so frequently. In a home, I would say this is maybe a little less appropriate because we don't have those kinds of greenhouse conditions. And if you don't have your plant in bright enough light, this moss might not dry out quickly enough and you could cause root rot on your plant. Now my big tip if you're gonna plant your orchid in moss is to use a pot that breathes. In my personal collection, the biggest and the most flowers I've ever gotten from an orchid was planted in a terracotta pot with straight long fiber sphagnum moss. These two combinations together worked really, really well. Now another really popular medium is orchid bark. Orchid bark has a lot of advantages because it creates a lot of airflow around the roots. Remember, because these orchids naturally grow with their roots constantly exposed to air, we need to plant them in something that's going to provide a lot of airflow in the pot. Now in this pot of orchid bark, there's tons of airflow, and that's because these organic chunky shapes don't really quite fit together very well. They are large, they are chunky, so there's naturally just going to be a lot of air gaps and a lot of airflow all around the roots. When it comes to planting your orchids in mediums, I think that's one of the most important aspects to consider. Is there a lot of airflow? There's tons of options out on the market as far as what you can be successful with in planting orchids, but the most important thing is making sure that they have the airflow. If your orchid doesn't have the right airflow, it's going to be really, really hard to keep them nice and happy and healthy and to get them to reflower those big, beautiful flowers that we love them for. Another very popular method is leca. This is lightweight expanded clay aggregate. Now, kind of like the orchid bark that we have over here, it's very chunky. There's a lot of air gaps in between each one of those. You can also keep them semi-hydroponically or completely hydroponically, and that means that the orchid isn't in any medium at all. It's just in a jar like this with a little bit of water. You don't usually cover the entire root system with water. You usually just dangle the tips in there. If you want more information on semi-hydro or hydroponic growing orchids, there's tons of information on how to be successful with that online. I've also done a few videos myself on the matter. Does your orchid pot need to be clear, or can you plant it in something solid? On a lot of my orchid videos, when I don't plant in something clear like this, I get a ton of comments saying, you have to plant in something clear. The reason you get those kinds of comments are, again, because these plants grow on the sides of trees with their roots constantly exposed. And these orchid roots are actually kind of special because they do photosynthesize. So the thought is, by putting them in something clear like this, they're still going to get sunlight down to their roots so that they can photosynthesize. But the truth of the matter is they don't need to photosynthesize. If you plant in something completely dark, just like this, and the roots never see any light, that's going to be perfectly fine because you have the leaves up here, which are your primary source of photosynthesis anyway. Does it help to plant in something clear like this? Marginally, yes. The roots are going to photosynthesize a little bit, but the real magic of a clear pot is actually because the roots will tell you when they want to be watered. Completely silver roots like we've got right here means the plant is ready to be watered. If the roots are green, you don't water. So it's much easier to see when the roots need to be watered when you have it in a clear pot, as opposed to something solid like terracotta. Another common thing I see is orchid pots. Do I have to plant in an orchid pot? Now the reason this is called an orchid pot is because it has holes on the sides of the pot. And again, this is to allow for more airflow to the roots to more closely mimic what the plant would receive in nature with so much airflow going around their roots. These are not necessary, but again, they do help with providing more airflow around the roots, which is never a bad thing. Today I'm actually going to be using the orchid medium that we make here in-house. This is our Phalaenopsis Orchid mix, and I'm going to be planting in a clear orchid pot. But how do I know what size pot to use for my plant? Now this orchid came out of a 4-inch pot, but we did lose a few roots. It's important to know that you don't always increase the pot size of your plants. It really depends on the size of the root ball. When we're keeping plants indoors, away from the heat and the airflow and the really intense light that outdoor plants are going to see, it's a really good idea to actually restrict your pot size a little bit to help with airflow, to help with drainage, to help your roots dry out a little bit quicker so they don't die from root rot. You can see right here that the roots are quite jam-packed in there. They're already circling around the bottom, and there's not a whole lot of room for them to go anywhere. If I were to plant this orchid in this pot, it would be perfectly fine for years to come. But I really want my orchid to get a little bit larger. And more importantly, I want a lot more roots. So I'm going to plant this in a pot that's a little bit larger. Still, the roots are not going to be swimming in a big old giant pot, but as you can see right here, the roots are no longer swirling around the bottom of the pot, and there's going to be plenty of room for them to grow out and create a really big, healthy root system. Now, the orchid medium that we use right here is orchid bark, a little bit of long fiber sphagnum moss, and some perlite. This is going to create a lot of drainage, a lot of airflow around the roots, and it's a fantastic mix for your orchids. All I'm going to do is center up my orchid, and I want to suspend the orchid so that the crown, which is this part right here, is about even with the total rim of the pot. Now, if you have any of these roots that are going all over the place, it's perfectly fine to now tuck them into the pot. These orchids don't have aerial roots or soil roots. They are all aerial roots, so you can always just tuck them into the soil if you don't like how crazy and wild they are. So now I've got it centered, I've got my crown elevated, and now I'm going to pour the orchid mix in there. Now, something that I really want to stress is the importance of getting a medium all around the roots. Yes, airflow is super important, but if we don't have medium, any of this bark or perlite or moss touching the roots, they might go without water, and eventually, without water, they will die. So we want to make sure that each and every root is coming into contact with some medium so that they have a source of water. There are a couple of ways that I like to ensure this. One thing you can do is tap your pot on a table like this. This is going to get all those little particles to settle in around the roots. You can also use something like a chopstick or a wooden bamboo skewer, and you can encourage the different little particles in and around the roots by poking holes down and in around the root system. Just be careful not to actually sever any of the roots. Another thing you can do is slap that pot. This is a lot like tapping the pot like this, but it's a little bit more fun and creepy. I definitely recommend, if you're going to slap the pot, to find someone or something to stare into while you're doing it. It definitely enhances the experience. Now, I want to show you the level that this is planted at. You can still see my crown right here is above the soil level. Now, if that was a little bit difficult to see, or if you still don't understand what the crown is, basically, you don't want any soil above any leaves. You want all of the soil, all of the medium, to be below the leaves. Now, at this point, I would give the plant a thorough soak. I would water all of the soil. You don't need to water the leaves at all. Just water the medium, the orchid bark, get everything nice, thoroughly saturated. But what do you do when all of your orchid flowers have fallen off? We have our orchid repotted, but you can see we still have this flower spike right here. And although it no longer has any flowers, we do have some decisions to make. So I'm gonna give you all of the options that you have, and at the end, I'm gonna give you my personal recommendation. The first thing you can do is just leave it alone. If you choose this option, there's a couple of things that might happen. You might notice that the stem from the very top is going to start to get brown, and that brown is going to work its way down all the way until it hits right where it came out of, the orchid. This stem will no longer be pliable. It would be more like a woody material. At that point, the orchid spike is completely died off, and you can go ahead and cut it off. It will not produce any more orchid flowers. The other thing that can happen is you might get a branch. So by leaving this on here, I might get another branch of flowers coming off this original branch. Or if you're really lucky and have proper care, you might get multiple branches. There's a hormone that kills off this entire branch after the flowers have died off. For some reason or another, sometimes that hormone just stops and it doesn't kill off the entire orchid stem. That's why sometimes the entire thing dies off and sometimes it doesn't. Now, the second thing you can do is actually interrupt that hormone. So as soon as the last flower dies off on your orchid spike, you can choose a place between nodes, and nodes are simply anywhere that a flower has come out of. So this is a node, this is a node, this is a node, and so on and so forth. So if I wanted to branch my orchid, as soon as the last flower has died off, I'm gonna take my clean pruners and choose a spot between two nodes. I'm gonna choose between this node and this node, and you can give the plant a little cut right there. So hopefully this is going to interrupt that hormone from killing off the entire spike. And then again, you should get another flower spike or two coming from the nodes below. Now the final option, and this is my personal recommendation, is to actually cut the entire flower spike off. So I follow the flower spike all the way down to where it comes out of the plant, right down in here, and I give one clean cut. Now, it's not important that you get all the way down there, but just cut off as much of the flower spike as you can. The reason I like to do this is because you're going to conserve the most amount of energy for the plant. By keeping this orchid spike alive, there's a lot of energy that's going to be constantly pumped into this flower spike. This flower spike does not give any energy in return, so it's constantly sucking energy away from the plant, but not giving any. So if you branch your orchid, these next flowers that come out are going to be smaller and there are going to be fewer of them than if you just remove it completely. So by removing the entire orchid spike, I'm going to give myself the best shot at getting the biggest flowers and the most amount of flowers the next time this orchid flowers. How often should your orchid be reflowering? This is a question I get all the time about orchids, and really it depends on a couple of things: genetics and care. Now, of course, you're not going to know the genetics of the plant when you pick it up at a store just like this one, but it is good to know that it does play a part. I have orchids that are getting identical care, 100% identical. One of them flowers about every 4 months. The other flowers about once a year. So that's what I mean by the difference in genetics. Now, the part that you do have bearing on is its care. Phalaenopsis orchids need very bright light in order to produce a flower. In fact, if your orchid hasn't flowered for more than a year, it's very likely that the plant is just not in bright enough light. What type of fertilizer should I use for my orchid? Usually when somebody comes to me with an orchid question, it's how do I get my orchid to flower? Now, before we head out, I want to talk about fertilizing your orchid a little bit, because this is typically the time where we begin fertilizing again. You don't fertilize your orchids while they are in spike. So it's really only after we've gotten rid of the spike, or when the plant is really starting to grow leaves instead of flowers, that we start to fertilize our orchids. Now, there are going to be a couple of options out there. One of them are going to be synthetically derived fertilizers, and one is going to be organic fertilizers. Now, whichever one you choose, I want you to find something that is orchid specific. This is going to be very good for your orchid, just to make sure you get the right ratios of nutrients to give your plant the best chance at flowering. Now, these fertilizers are going to come in liquid soluble form or granular form. Either of them is perfectly fine. One of them is just sort of a slow release. You don't have to remember to put it in your watering can with every watering or every other watering, whatever the directions say. So these are just basically little balls that go in and around your roots, shake it on top of the soil, and every time you water your plant, a little bit of those nutrients are going to trickle down into the roots. Liquid soluble is where you add a liquid to your water every time, or again, whatever the directions say, you add it to your water and the roots are going to be fed that way. That's the most like direct injection, immediately available for the plant to use as nutrients, and is a great way to fertilize your orchids as long as you can keep up with it. Now, the difference between synthetic and organic, there's not a lot of them practically speaking that you need to worry about. Really, the biggest difference is that with a synthetically derived fertilizer, you're going to want to cease fertilizing when you get your flower spike. This is because the orchid is no longer focused on growing leaves and is now focused on growing flowers. So it's really not going to be using that fertilizer as much, and you could risk burning some of the leaves by continuing to fertilize while the plant is in spike. However, with an organic fertilizer, you can fertilize with these year-round, and you never have to worry about whether the plant is in spike or not in spike to fertilize. And as long as you use it properly, you can even fertilize your orchids while they are in spike with an organic fertilizer, and you're not going to risk any burn. But that's going to do it for our Orchid Repot video today. I hope that covered all of your questions and everything that you need to know, and maybe you gained a little bit more confidence when it comes to repotting your orchids. If you're wanting to use the orchid soil that I used here today, you can head to our website, famousinoregon.com, under the soil section.